What's up, guys? I'm back again with a what if. And this time I want to do some JJK. I don't know why, I just randomly thought of it. So without too much of a hassle, let's go ahead and get straight into it. We start our story off with Azuka Midoriya being born as normal. But unlike this, the main story continues uninterrupted for most of it. Deku is a normal child, has his normal interests, still loves All Might, nothing's different. Until one day Deku is in preschool. By this point, Deku and the rest of his class has just been allowed outside to play. Izuku was a smart child, although a bit socially awkward, and probably not making a whole lot of friends, but this didn't hold Izuku back from being a bright and bubbly child. He was always excited and always ready to do something with someone. It didn't matter who. Izuku had one problem though, and that was Bakugo. At the age of 5 years old, before Bakugo got his quirk, they were, I'd hesitate to call them friends, but they were at least close. Their moms knew each other, and it made their lives intertwined in a sense. They were always around each other and always had to play. They always enjoyed it at first. That is until Bakugo got his quirk. Everyone began to praise Bakugo for how flashy his quirk was and how strong, saying that he would 100% become a great hero. Bakugo, being the child he was, ate this up with no restraint, and it immediately went to his head. He felt that he could no longer be associated with Deku, who at this point was 5 for about 3 months and still hadn't awakened a quirk. So it was safe to say Bakugo didn't want to associate with him. But that wasn't enough. Bakugo needed everyone to understand that that part of his life was over, done with. He was no longer like everyone else. So he did what all people do. He found someone weaker than him and smaller than him and began to pick on them. That person just so happened to be his former associate and possibly friend, Izuku. Izuku found himself just simply playing, not really doing much of anything, but satisfied with himself by himself. So he was okay. When all of a sudden he was kicked down, Izuku turned around, scandalized. He had no idea what had just happened and why he was kicked, only to see Bakugo. He thought for a second to smile, to look upwards, to be happy. Bakugo hadn't come to play with him in quite some time. He was excited. When he noticed that Bakugo didn't seem to have a friendly look on his face, he seemed angry. And as he began to ask that question, he was told to shut up curtly by Bakugo. He was then told all of the reasons why Bakugo was so much better than him and why he had nothing and wanted nothing to do with Izuku ever again. And to illustrate this point, he told his goons to grab Izuku's arms. They did as they were told. They moderately questioned what Bakugo was going to do, but thought it would be funny to watch. Bakugo then told Deku, now calling him Deku, that he was going to be a hero, and that heroes exterminated villains. But in order to do that, he was going to need to be the best, and the best operate alone. So he then began to use his explosive quirk on Deku in his face. Not close enough to burn him, but definitely enough to where Deku was uncomfortable and screaming a little bit. Not too much, because obviously people would notice, but he was beginning to cry after a while. With tears in his eyes and struggling to get out, Bakugo stopped and looked him in the face and told him simply, Deku, at a certain point, you just have to accept that you're quirkless and that you're not going to be anything. It's okay. Not everyone is destined to be great. Those who are have it, and those who aren't don't. So be proud that you were once around me, similar to me, close to me. Who knows, when you get older, maybe you can even tell your kids that you knew me as a child. Bakugo, with having said his piece, was done. He told his boys to let go of Deku, and they did. They threw him to the ground, and they all walked away. Bakugo walked about 10 feet further, then turned around, looked at Deku, and kept walking. Deku was on the ground crying. Now, some of the kids did notice what happened, but they didn't really seem to care. As, honestly speaking, Bakugo was going on a little bit of a rampage, as the teachers all loved him and didn't tell him anything, and even when he did get caught, all he would say is that he was still getting the hang of his quirk. And, teachers see what they want to see, so of course they accepted this answer, even though it was a blatant lie, and then just told the other kids that Bakugo was going through a rough time and that they should try to support him. They fed into his ego a lot and nourished it so that it never went down and he always got a big head. No one came to help Izuku as he just laid there for a moment, wondering what he had done, what he had possibly done to make Bakugo so angry. He still couldn't find an answer. So after a while, he picked himself up, crying and went to go wipe his face. As he did, he vowed that he would understand Bakugo and learn why he did what he did and why he was so angry with him. The next day, Izuku initiated their conversation. He walked up to Bakugo, holding his shirt, looking down with tears in his eyes, asking Bakugo why he had attacked him. Bakugo pretended as if he'd never heard it, never seen it, never done it. He told Deku that he didn't know what he was talking about, as he quietly raised his hand towards Izuku, softly insinuating that if Deku started talking or started saying something, that he would get punished. Izuku flinched, and Bakugo began to laugh, and he asked Deku if he was scared, if something was wrong, if he needed the nurse. Was he hurt? Deku was trembling at this point, tears freely flowing down his face. He was really intimidated and really scared. He was surrounded at this point by Bakugo's goons and Bakugo. Izuku, being the way he was, just closed his eyes, resigning himself to his fate. When all of a sudden, something happened. Izuku didn't hear any more noise. The usual bustle and laughter of the kids and talking of the teachers and even the birds and all the animals, it was gone. He couldn't hear anything. He couldn't feel anything. After a few more seconds, he opened his eyes to see he was somewhere. Izuku didn't know where he was. He was like in an ocean of nothingness. He was standing, but there was no ground. He could see, but it was entirely dark in every direction he looked. There was nothing. Nothing near him, nothing close to him. He was completely isolated. Izuku felt alone and was about to cry when all of a sudden there was a crack, and black shards of glass almost fell down as Izuku fell back onto his butt, looking up to see Bakugo, who had appeared to have punched something. He looked furious. Deku, you had a quirk this whole time and you hid it from me? You thought you were better than me, didn't you? Izuku was very confused at this point. He had no idea what was going on or how this had happened. But he knew for a fact that Bakugo was going to take it out of him, so he went to apologize but was stopped. Bakugo didn't want to talk anymore. Izuku began to run, but he was grabbed by the goons and turned around, and Bakugo punched him. That was the first time Deku had ever been hit in the face, or at all, really, in his very short, very young life. He didn't know what to do, so he began to cry. Bakugo, realizing that he had just punched Izuku out of anger, was slightly shocked with himself, as he hadn't meant to actually hit the boy, but his anger had taken over so much that he punched him, and with everything he could. Deku's face was already beginning to bruise, and so Bakugo panicked and told him and his goons to hurry up and leave before threatening Deku that if he told anyone, he would do it again. Bakugo then quickly ran away, intimidating Deku enough not to get in trouble. Little did he know that this would be the start of something that he would himself would not be able to quite quantify for the rest of his life. We then have a short time skip. After this incident, we'll call it, Izuku began to realize that Bakugo really was no longer his friend. That there was no more talking. There was no more trying to convey what was going on. Bakugo had clearly made it clear that if he didn't do what he wanted him to do, he would abuse him physically. So the only thing he could do was to withstand it, or so he thought. But he also wanted to understand where he went, what had happened. Bakugo said he had a quirk, and although Bakugo was cruel, he wasn't a liar. He never had any reason to really lie, and he'd never lied to Izuku in any case. So Izuku had no reason to think that he was just lying to him. So he did what was natural to him. He began to write everything that he knew down and see what happened. Over the course of a few months of time, he began to experiment. By this point, his mother had asked if he wanted to go to the quirk doctor, but Izuku said no, which surprised Inko greatly because all her son could talk about was the fact that he had been to the quirk doctor, or that he wanted to go at least. But now all of a sudden, he didn't seem to care anymore. Izuku told his mother that he had a quirk and that he was trying to awaken it again. His mother didn't quite understand what was going on, and she didn't know if her son was just being delusional because he was denying that he didn't have a quirk, or if he actually did. But either way, she was nervous. She didn't want to pressure her son too much because it could make whatever was happening with him worse. But she also didn't want him to be experimenting with a quirk by himself if he really did have one. So she begrudgingly told him that he could, but only while she was watching him. Most of the time, this resulted in absolutely nothing. In fact, for the first year and a half, Izuku didn't actually do anything. His quirk, quote unquote, didn't happen. Nothing happened. After a while, about the first 2 weeks, Inko had immediately known that her son was probably just lying to himself. Though she didn't fully believe that because she saw the sureness on his face, so she would check up on him every now and again through his training sessions, quote unquote. But she would make it a note not to spend all day watching him as she was pretty sure nothing was going to happen. That year and a half had proceeded as that. Inko randomly checking in on him and a new 6-year-old Izuku just minding his business, doing whatever he did. But nothing ever happened. Izuku began to realize that for some reason or another, his quirk did not want to react, and he didn't know why that was. So he began to analyze everything that happened that day. At first, Izuku thought pain was the trigger, so he began to pinch himself and use rubber bands, but nothing seemed to work. After that, he surmised that maybe it was stress, so he began to think of the most stressful things he could, the most fear-inducing things he could. Even then, nothing happened. Now, the machinations of a 6-year-old, aren't that sophisticated, but Izuku was quite smart for his age, so he began to sit and think. If pain wasn't the trigger and fear wasn't the trigger or stress wasn't the trigger, what could it possibly be? He then began to think back to that moment. Before he had gotten attacked or gotten hit, he was by himself. Well, when he got teleported. But before that, he was standing there with his hands down and he wanted them to stop. So Deku began to think maybe his quirk was like a Eraserhead's quirk. Maybe it stopped things from happening, but only with a certain condition. Azuka began to theorize that at this point, his quirk probably had some kind of activation cue that needed to happen, some kind of catalyst. Maybe it was his hands. Azuka began to fiddle with his hands a lot, trying to replicate the circumstances. He even put on the same clothes that he was wearing that day when he got attacked by Bakugo. Nothing quite seemed to work until Izuku just decided to stand still and calm down. Izuku calmed down, put his hands in the same position they were when he was telling Bakugo that he wanted to be left alone, and he opened his eyes. And again, that same feeling washed over him, the nothingness. Izuku had done it. He had finally re-accessed whatever it was he'd accessed prior. He was again in a place that was dark. There was nothing in every direction as far as he could see. It seemed like it would go on forever. But then Izuku began to quickly realize that he was good because he figured out how to get in, but how did he get out? The only thing he knew so far was that it could be broken, but that was from wherever it was outside. But he wasn't outside. So Izuku began to think, well, maybe it'll just turn off after a while. Izuku didn't know how long he had been in wherever he was, but he figured that while he was here, he would at least try to learn something about it. He tried to explore the area, but it seemed like every time he took a step, it just kept going on and on and on and on and on. There was never really anything to go towards, so he just began to sit and think. After the first couple of hours, or at least he thought are hours, he realized that his fear wasn't going to get him anywhere, and that there was nothing in here, so he had no reason to be afraid. Izuku, unlike most children, weren't actually afraid of the dark, considering that, well, that was the only time he had ever been in the complete darkness of like that type of situation, and it had been positive, so he'd had a positive experience with being in the dark to counteract all the bad ones, so he was no longer afraid. After this, Izuku had realized something quite important. He was now in here, very, very, very far from home, or at least what he thought. He realized his original plan to just wait for something to happen was quite flawed, so he decided to do something. He put his hands in that same sign again and began just saying different words. Out, release, let go, stop. He cycled through as many words as he knew at that time to try and see if he could get whatever was happening to stop. Until eventually he got tired and simply sighed, saying, enough. And when he opened his eyes, it was gone. It was like nothing had ever happened. He was just back in his room next to his bed, standing there. Izuku was excited beyond words, and he immediately began to jump up and down, so happy, first to be home, but second that he'd finally understood his power. His mother rushed up the stairs, wondering why her son was jumping or what was that thumping, but she saw Izuku just ecstatic, and she couldn't help but smile for a brief moment. But then she realized that something must have happened. So she asked Izuku what happened, and Izuku told his mother that he had found out what his quirk was. And she asked him out of curiosity what it was, and he said, I can go to a dark place. Now, that was not very specific or very accurate. And Inko was quite confused, but he's a 6-year old trying to explain a domain expansion, so obviously he couldn't put it any better than that. Inko cautiously smiled, saying, okay, honey, that's amazing, she said curiously, wondering what that meant or what it did or how it worked. She then asked if he was all right and if he was hungry and that he should stop for the day since it had been some time. Izuku hadn't noticed, but he had felt like he had been gone for a few minutes, and in reality, pretty much no time had passed. Izuku felt he was gone for a while, maybe 30 minutes, maybe more, but outside it had been no time at all. It had only been about 2 minutes. So Izuku realized that time must have worked differently. He immediately went to run over to jump onto his bed to grab his notebook to start writing when Inko began to walk away, shaking her head with a smile on it, telling her son to come downstairs. Now we have a pretty big time skip. At this point, or our last point, Izuku was 6 years old. Now, Izuku is not. He is 12. By this point, Izuku had fully understood how to activate and deactivate his domain. But unfortunately, that was about it. Izuku, over his years of having his abilities, had understood two things. The first was that Izuku could not bring anybody else into his domain. For whatever reason, he didn't know why, he didn't know how, but no other living thing, trees, people, and anything else couldn't happen. It couldn't be brought in for whatever reason. That was the first thing he learned. The second thing he learned was that his domain was a thing that didn't necessitate him being in it. This he learned by simply trying to do it and trying to leave, but also trying to maintain it. This took him about a year to do, But eventually, Izuku realized that he no longer needed to be in there. That for whatever reason, he was not the center of whatever that was. The black ball, as he began to call it, since that's what it looked like, a black orb that just was floating there. After this realization, Izuku then started to think to himself, if he didn't need to be inside his domain in order for it to work, then what else could he do? So he began to experiment further. By this point, he already knew a couple of things about his domain, like he could activate it fairly quickly, he needed to do a certain amount of hand signs, and a few other things. Izuku had been well and truly familiar with his powers after a certain while, but had come nowhere near close to fully understanding them. Inko by this point was trying to help her son, but she didn't really understand it. He seemed to, but she didn't get it, as she didn't understand why his powers manifested a black orb, as, like I said previously, the only person who could go inside at the moment was Izuku, and since she couldn't, all she saw was Izuku disappear, and a black orb take its place, and then Azuka would leave, and sometimes the orb would be there, and sometimes it wouldn't. She didn't quite understand what was happening, but she knew that something was. So she asked Azuku about it. He began to explain it to her the best he could, but she still didn't quite get it. But she did understand the fact that Azuku kind of had a force field of sorts. At least that's how she could best understand it. Azuku nodded to her, just saying, yeah, it's something like that. But it's like a force field that only I can enter and no one else can. It's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Inko nodded at this, suspecting as much considering that the orb was only about the size of a basketball and Azuku was not the size of a basketball. She then asked him a question. What could it do? Izuku shrugged his shoulders. So far, nothing. As every time he'd entered his domain, it was the same. A black nothingness that went on forever. Inko then again asked if he had ever tried to bring something into the domain. He nodded, saying that he had tried a couple of times, but for whatever reason, it would only pick up things, but not actually bring them into the domain. And side note, they're not calling it a domain. It's just easier to call it that than like the black orb or whatever. So they're not actually calling it a domain. I'll make a point to explain that when they do come up with a name for it. So yeah. Inko had surmised with her own abilities at least that Izuku had a power kind of similar to hers. How she could control small objects and bring them towards her. Perhaps Izuku was the center of his own sort of kind of magnetic field, how he attracted things. Inko asked Izuku if he was needed to be inside of his domain. She After she asked him this, Izuku answered with a shrug, saying, well, no, not all the time at least. I don't need to be inside of the domain, but I don't know if I'm the center or not. I guess when I'm inside of the domain, I'm the center, and when I'm outside of it, then I'm not. She then asked if Izuku was actually trying to pull things or trying to teleport them. Izuku asked her what the difference was. She said that when you're trying to pull something, at least with her powers and her experience, she needed to focus on the object being brought to her, and she was the focus point. Even though she used her hands to sort of kind of guide it, it was more like her body was the central pillar that attracted everything. And that's what it was really attracted to, not her hands. So if he wanted to pull something in, he would need to designate something as the center, kind of like a planet and how planets orbit stars. It's the center. They orbit around a center. Izuku thought about this for a moment, noticing that his mother had a lot more insight than he thought. He smiled at her, telling her that he would try it, and that she should stay where she was. She was a bit surprised at this, looking at him as if to say, you're testing this now and trying to pull me? Izuku smiled at his mother, telling her not to worry, that at this point, he didn't exactly know everything about his ability, but he did know for sure how to turn it on and off so that she would be perfectly safe. Now, Inko was not entirely comfortable with this. Later on, she would admit that, but she didn't introduce the idea, and she felt it was at least her duty to try and be the test subject since she did bring the idea to his attention. After this, Izuku established a domain. Outside of it, he was outside. He was not the center. Izuku then asked if she felt any pull. She said no. Izuku looked back at the orb and began to focus. And slowly the orb disappeared. Izuku then thought to himself, maybe a domain without me in it can't function as it normally is supposed to. So he opened another domain, but this time he was inside of it. Inko saw her son disappear and the black orb take his place as usual. But this time, something else happened. The black orb disappeared. Inko stood up for a second, slightly worried as this hadn't happened before, and all the time she'd seen in practice, this had never taken place. The orb was always there, and Izuku was always there. One of the two were always outside and visible, so something was wrong. She began to walk forward when all of a sudden she blinked and she was, where was she at? She couldn't see anything. Nothing was around her. Everything was dark, and it all was almost like she was stepping on liquid darkness, like an ocean that was as black as the night sky. She couldn't understand where she was. She figured this must be what she had told her son about, or what her son had told her about. How this is what he saw inside of the sphere. But she wondered why Izuku wasn't here, unless Izuku had left. Meanwhile, Izuku was also in the sphere, but he could see his mother looking around, but she couldn't see him for some reason. Izuku was right in front of her, actually, waving his hand in front of her face, but she didn't seem to see him. She seemed to walk through him. He didn't understand how that functioned, but he figured it must have been how the domain interacted. He then released it, and they both were right where the orb was prior, and where Izuku was standing prior. Inko had been grabbed and moved into the domain, and when it was released, she had been spit out where Izuku was last standing. Izuku was excited. He smiled and hugged his mother, saying he could see her, that she couldn't see him for some reason, but she looked very scared, so he began to hug her tightly. Inko was a bit worried, but also kind of nervous, because although she had given Izuku that advice, she didn't expect it to take root, to work. That was a rudimentary explanation at best and complete nonsense at worst. There was no way Izuku could just pick it up like that, just make something that didn't work that way simply because she had told him to. So that caught her attention a bit, but she was happy for her son. After this, Izuku would begin experimenting quite often. These experiments often inconveniencing Inko because she would all of a sudden be cooking and then she would be in Izuku's room and he would be on his bed laughing, telling his mother that he wanted to talk to her for a quick second about snacks. And when dinner was going to be done, it didn't feel like walking. He got a kick out of every time she was teleported randomly throughout the house to Izuku because of his domain. Inko began to be quite annoyed by her son's antics, but she also was happy that he was happy. Though she was very annoyed at the fact that she couldn't go 5 minutes without being randomly teleported to his room for some reason. That was a bit unsettling and infuriating. After this point, Izuku's progress seemed to skyrocket and go much, much faster for some reason, like he had got over a plateau. For some reason, now Izuku could pull inanimate objects into his domain also. There didn't seem to be a limit. His domain seemed to be infinite in space, at least from what Inko could understand, and from what Izuku could understand. First, it was with objects. He would pull random objects into the domain that he was in. And sooner or later, eventually, he wouldn't even need to be in the domain himself for that thing to be grabbed. And finally, he began to move the domain individually. This came as a shock to both of them because they neither had actually expected that. Because never had ever in the entire history of his domain had he ever moved the black orb from one spot to another. This was very odd because Izuku hadn't even done it intentionally. He didn't know it could move. He left it and went somewhere else into the house and came back and it had followed him. Izuku had walked and it was behind him the entire time. He had noticed it because he wasn't paying attention, but it had followed him. Izuku left it and then told it to come toward him, sort of, in a non-verbal way, and it did. Izuku shrugged his shoulders, guessing he had just never actually tried to move it, thinking that it wasn't a thing that could move and it was just stationary. Over the next few years, Izuku had begun to practice and hone his domain expansion much, much more. By this point, Izuku could easily manifest his domain very quickly, even without hand signs or any kind of verbal commands, and it would appear. He could grab people and inanimate objects alike, as well as animals and plants, and bring them into his domain, where they would just basically have to sit until he decided what to do with them or didn't. He could release the domain wherever he wanted and move the domain while the people were in it. For a while, it was pretty cool, especially since whenever Bakugo would try to antagonize him, he would just plop him in the domain, lift the domain high into the sky, and then release him from the domain and let him fall. Now, Izuku was not, how should I say this, kind to Bakugo after what happened to him. Though he wasn't nearly as cruel as Bakugo, he took every opportunity possible to make sure Bakugo felt every bit of embarrassment and every bit of regret that he could over his actions by tormenting him, so to speak. It first started when Bakugo would attempt to go from his house to school because Izuku and Bakugo lived quite close and their routes for walking to school converged after a certain point. Izuku would wait for Bakugo to walk past, and then grab him into his domain and release him in a split second. Basically, he would restart him at the beginning of the street over and over and over again, so much so that they would both be late, and Bakugo would get infuriated trying to walk forward but not being able to. Eventually, he would come out and pat Bakugo on the back really harshly, sending him stumbling forward a little bit, and Bakugo would turn around angry. He looked at Izuku and then began to run at him when he snapped his fingers and Bakugo was again inside of his domain. Bakugo hadn't been in his domain before, but he had saw it, so he recognized that he was inside of the domain, and he saw it when he broke through it when they were kids. He saw the inside, which was way bigger than the outside. He immediately did what Bakugo is known to do. He got angry and started throwing explosions everywhere, but unfortunately for him, they did absolutely nothing. Izuku threw his domain forward at quite a quick speed and released it, and Bakugo was sent flying out of the domain and crashing into a tree, slamming his back into it. Izuku looked at Bakugo and wondered if he should care, and then he decided he didn't, and he walked to school. Bakugo arrived at school much, much later. After having woken up from being knocked unconscious, he saw Izuku, and Izuku smiled at him, waving like they were the best friends. Well, the best of friends. Bakugo was infuriated by this, but had decided that his anger had clouded his judgment last time and that he would wait. He would plan. If Izuku wanted to mess with him, he would mess with him back, but better. So he sat down, unsuspectingly, not trying to be, anything, not trying to draw any suspicion to himself, at least not from Izuku, and he waited. He waited the entire class period until after Izuku had let his guard down for a split second, and he shot an explosion at Izuku's desk, sending it up, and it hit Izuku right in the chin. And that made Izuku's face bleed. Bakugo had turned around as if nothing happened, and Izuku actually hadn't saw Bakugo do it, but he understood that it was Bakugo. By this point, things had started to escalate. Over the next few years, they would continue to do these back and forth things, and these would even turn into all-out brawls where Bakugo would go from in between Izuku's domain to in the outside world. Izuku would use his domain to block and would realize how ineffective that was. As his domain was broken from the outside, he was grabbed by the throat and punched in the face. Izuku kicked Bakugo back many, many times, trying to get away, and Bakugo would catch him effortlessly. He began to realize two things from these scuffles they had. The first was that his domain was absolutely terrible at protecting him while he was inside, and the second was that it was great at keeping things inside, but not stopping things from getting in. Ozuku had begun to try and evade on his own and catch Bakugo in his domain, but he really didn't have all too many moves because at this point, the only thing he could do was lift his domain into a high place and release the person inside, or throw his domain forward and let the person out, making him slam into something. Bakugo was no slouch, though. He could use his abilities to sort of kind of fly or glide, and his reaction was quick enough to avoid slamming into surfaces. So after a while, it just evolved into Izuku constantly getting beaten. But Izuku would never back down from it, though. He would always challenge Bakugo whenever Bakugo messed with him, and they would continue to go at it. But unfortunately, Izuku wouldn't win as many bouts as he would like to, considering that, well, he had really no offensive capabilities at this moment. Inko was worried, obviously, that her son would come home with bruises, but Izuku would only smile, even with bloody teeth and a messed up face, simply saying he gave as good as he got. Now, this was a lie, a blatant one, because he had not given as good as he got. He'd gotten beaten brutally. Inko had begged and pleaded for him to tell her who had done this, but Izuku said he wouldn't believe her if he told she wouldn't believe him if he told her. She then said that she would, and Izuku then just sighed, saying if he didn't do it himself, it wouldn't matter. She didn't understand what that meant and begged her son to tell her, but Izuku was not budging. This was his fight, and his fight alone, and in his way, he would win. Izuku began to think and plan. He realized that his barriers or his domain was quite strong on the inside and great at capturing things, but very poor at stopping things from entering. Izuku didn't quite understand why that was, as he didn't quite understand his powers all that well. But he did understand two things. The first was that he had a certain amount of influence over the domain and the space within, so he could change it. When he decided it wanted it to follow him, he could. A while ago, he couldn't even move it, but now he could. He could turn it on and off. He could expand it and capture people in it. So he decided that he was going to experiment further. At this point, he experimented with partially manifesting. After a certain amount of time, he began, experimenting with this concept, and he got better and better and better. Eventually, he could. He could make a sort of wall of a black glass-like material that was very, very durable on the outside and very, very weak on the inside. He would use this as his shield to keep Bakugo away from him for while he would plan and strategize. Eventually, Bakugo would find a way to get around this, but he would always get hit with another one, or get captured in the domain. Eventually, it became a stalemate because Bakugo had the offensive capabilities to end the fight, but unfortunately for him, his stamina was not nearly as high as Deku's, who could do this all day and who could perpetually keep himself away from him or trap him in his domain whenever he got too close. It basically led to a stalemate because neither could finish the other, and it just wasn't working. So eventually they decided they would settle this later on when one of them could defeat the other. This rivalry had become quite widespread throughout the school, and everyone knew to avoid either of these guys because they were both crazy. At least everyone thought they were because of how they fought like cats and dogs every single time they saw each other. Some people even suspected that maybe this was some kind of relationship drama and that they were just fighting because they didn't know who was going to be the man in the relationship. But it just didn't matter to most of them. So after this, we have another minor time skip. And this is where we're actually going to get into the original story territory. Izuku was preparing himself for his final day at, I guess that would be middle school since UA is like a high school, right? I don't think it's a college. So I guess his final day at middle school. He prepared himself. Izuku had grown quite a bit, a lot more than he did in canon. He's about the same height as Bakugo and has not a similar build. He's a bit lighter, a bit more lean, but he also has a lot of musculature and he is athletic in build. That's due to him always having to be quick and agile, dodging and ducking, getting away from, Bakugo and his attacks over the years. He dressed himself quickly and quietly without a word. He walked downstairs to see his mother making breakfast, and she asked him if he wanted some, and he said he did. He sat down and gave her a smile. She asked him if he was ready. He didn't ask for what because he knew what was. They were both looking at the envelope that was on their table. Izuku was nervous. Nervous is not a word that Azuku usually likes to use because he always likes to be in control of things. That's how he works. But he was nervous to see what this envelope had. His mother had told him a while ago that it had came or was going to arrive on this day, so he was prepared, but he was still nervous. So he did what every kid would do. He wanted to open it, but he decided not to. That was for a very important reason. His mother gave him his breakfast and he received it. He ate his breakfast, kissed his mother on the cheek, and began to leave for school. Now, the school day is boring enough, so no one's going to go over that, so we're good to the final part. The final part where the teacher walks in and asks them all about what they want to be. Now, this goes a little differently. Normally, everyone would say they want to be heroes, and they did, like normal. And that would include Izuku, who also said he wanted to be a hero. But Bakugo, being the way he is, could not let such a thing slide and immediately looked at Izuku, turning his face up, saying, I know you're not thinking you'll actually be able to be a hero. At best, you'll be some D-lister sidekick, and you'll never make it anywhere. Izuku smiled at Bakugo and simply said, Bakugo, why do you insist on being a pain in the ass all the time? Wouldn't it be better if you found something else to occupy your time? You're just as good of a student as I am, so why do you insist on being an asshole? Bakugo stood up, knocking his desk over, saying, You want to take this outside? I remember the score, and in my remembrance, I'm still in the lead. I've been kicking your ass for years now. The teacher began to get a little nervous as he knew he couldn't actually stop these two students as he was just a regular guy. And second, he didn't get paid enough to do this shit anyway, and it was his final day. But he also didn't want to get some flack for letting two students fight with their powers and destroy the school building. Izuku stayed sitting down and simply looked up at Bakugo, saying, Bakugo, why do I even have to react to a person like you? If I wanted to, you could be trapped for a very long time, and I wouldn't even have to get up out of my seat. Bakugo said, Well, you could, but then you'd be a bitch, and, well, that would give me satisfaction you wouldn't know. Izuku was a bit ticked off with this, as he knew that Bakugo understood how to goad him into a fight, and he also knew that Bakugo knew that he knew how to do this, but every time he always did. Before they could begin to fight, the school bell rang and it was time to leave. Bakugo smirked, saying, Saved by the bell, dickhead, and he left. Izuku sighed, saying that that was quite pointless and it never amounted to anything. Izuku hadn't even heard what the teacher said because he, well, didn't. They were too busy talking and the teacher had just continued the lesson. So Izuku had at this point did the only thing he could think of. He got up, grabbed his stuff, and went home. After he arrived home, he told his mom hi, and she told him, Was he ready? Izuku said yes. They both sat down around the table to see a letter from UA. Izuku opened it slowly, tentatively, almost if it would break and he would cry. Inko was waiting. Izuku read, Congratulations. You have been selected to come to UA's testing grounds for your exam. Izuku was a bit shocked at this. That didn't sound very congratulatory, especially since they made it sound like he got accepted, and Inko was also tricked by this, and so was he. He had gotten excited for a second, just for them to tell him that he was actually going to take a test to determine whether or not he actually got in. He thought that was a bit of fuckery, but he didn't say that out loud, and he just put it down saying, Well, it looks like I'll have my chance to prove myself. Inko smiled, leaning over the table and grabbing his son and hugging him closely, saying, I'm sure you'll do great, son. You don't even need to try. Izuku hugged his mother back, saying that he'll do his best, and his mother said that she knew he would. She also wondered if he should ask some of those teachers about his quirk and how odd it is, as she had never heard of, seen, or even know how to categorize a quirk like Izuku's. Izuku nodded, thinking that it might actually make a lot of sense to talk to the teachers at UA, as they were some of the best heroes and some of the most highly trained experts on quirks and how they function, so he decided he would also try that. But Izuku hadn't fully finished reading, as Inko picked up the paper, and as he was beginning to make his way, he told him to stop. She then looked at Izuku and said, It's a 10-month time. It's a 10-month time gap between now and when you'll take that test. Izuku was a bit alarmed. 10 months? He didn't need 10 months. He could do it now. Inko looked at her son, already knowing what was going through his head, and simply said, Son, just think of this as time to get better. Izuku sighed, wondering why the world always had to take so long to get to the good part. But he smiled, saying that he would, and waved away his mother as he went upstairs. I think I'm going to end this part right here, as I think it's a pretty good place to leave off, as I've developed them enough and given them a lot of character. And I think it would be better if we started the second part where he was going on this 10-month training arc or time skip or whatever to develop him further. And I don't want to do that now because this video is always already kind of long. So I think I'll stop it here. But yeah, as far as things like his domain expansion's name and what do you guys think it should do, definitely comment that down below because I don't really have a whole lot of ideas because I don't know how to give him anything that doesn't make him just like busted. And I forgot to mention it at the beginning, but Azuku's verse is already like a year ahead of him. So in terms of like skill and experience, take where all of the students were a year after being at UA, and that's how all of the students at UA are. So I buffed the verse specifically because Azuku has a domain. So yeah. But yeah, for real though, with the domain expansion name and what you think it should do, yeah, comment that down below. So with that being said, peace.